All right, let's dive into a story that's got to be one of the most unusual in religious history. It's got faith, it's got leadership, and, believe it or not, a perfectly timed punchline that stopped what you might call a celestial barbecue. So, what happens when you try to barbecue your prophet with fire from heaven? I know, it sounds like a bad stand-up routine, but this is a true story. And the punchline? It's way funnier and more clever than you can possibly imagine. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're going back in time to the 1830s. The place? Kirtland, Ohio. Now, back then, Kirtland wasn't just some sleepy little town. It was the absolute ground zero for a brand new, super intense, and, let's be honest, kind of weird religious movement. Yeah, see, this whole period in America was called the Second Great Awakening. Think of it like a spiritual wildfire sweeping across the country. And Kirtland, it was the heart of the blaze. It was basically a spiritual mosh pit, packed with people desperate for a direct connection to the divine. Everyone was looking for a sign. So when the first converts to this new Mormon faith started showing up in Kirtland, they brought all that wild, revivalist energy with them. Their meetings, well, they were less hymns and prayers and more like a full-on spiritual rave. You had people barking like dogs, rolling around on the floor, twitching uncontrollably. I mean, it was pure, unadulterated conviction for sure, but it was also total chaos. So, into this scene walks the leader of the movement, Joseph Smith, and he takes one look around and is basically like, whoa, okay, people, let's just dial it back a bit. He could see the faith was real, but he also knew you couldn't build a church on this kind of energy alone. He needed order. He was trying to build a temple, not, a three-ring circus. And right here, this is where our story really kicks off, because you have two major players about to collide. It's the classic setup, right? The guy trying to bring order versus the guy who is just absolutely living for the chaos. So let me introduce you to Sylvester Smith. Now, this guy was, by all accounts, a true believer, but he was also, a lot. His spiritual volume knob was just permanently stuck on 11. He was absolutely convinced he was getting messages from on high, and those messages were always, shall we say, big, loud, and dramatic. So here's where it all comes to a head. During a meeting, Sylvester feels like his own personal revelations, the visions he's having, the messages he thinks he's getting, are being totally sidelined by Joseph's new let's be orderly approach. And Sylvester, well, he did not appreciate that. Not one bit. He gets furious, like white-hot angry. And in this moment of what he sees as righteous, divine fury, he decides to take things to the next level, a biblical level. So he stands up in the middle of everyone, points his finger straight at Joseph Smith, and tries to call down fire from heaven to burn him to a crisp. Right then and there. I mean, we're way past a simple disagreement now. This is attempted celestial arson. The whole room must have just gone completely silent. But Joseph Smith's reaction is not what you'd expect. He doesn't panic. He doesn't even look scared. He just starts laughing. Not a little chuckle either, a full-on, deep belly laugh. And that laugh just shatters the tension, right? It just highlights how completely absurd this whole thing is. And then, once he catches his breath, he delivers what has to be one of the greatest theological smackdowns of all time. It's a comeback so perfect, so sharp, it just completely punctures Sylvester's whole dramatic performance. He looks Sylvester right in the eye and says, "You are acting like one of Baal's prophets." Okay, now, for us today, that might sound a little random, but for everyone in that room who knew their Bible inside and out, this was an absolutely devastating insult. So what's he talking about? Okay, so here's the backstory. It comes from this epic showdown in the Old Testament. You've got the prophet Elijah on one side, and on the other, 450 prophets of this false god, Baal. The Baal guys, they spend all day shouting, dancing, even cutting themselves, trying to get their god to send fire. And crickets. Nothing happens. Then it's Elijah's turn. He soaks his altar with water to make it harder, says one quiet, simple prayer, and boom, fire from heaven comes down and vaporizes everything. So you see the genius of this comeback, right? In one sentence, Joseph is saying, first off, your power isn't real. Second, you're all noise and no action. And third, and maybe most importantly, you look absolutely ridiculous right now. It was a perfect, multi-layered takedown that just ended the whole thing right there on the spot. Okay, so it's a fantastic story, right? But why are we even talking about it? Why does this one weird, funny moment actually matter? Well, it turns out that single laugh and that one line had a huge effect on how the early church developed. So, this whole fire from heaven fiasco had 4 big takeaways. First, it instilled a sense of order. It taught people to tell the difference between real inspiration and just, wild enthusiasm. Second, it really revealed Joseph Smith's character. He was quick, he was witty, he was human. Third, it hammered home this idea of stewardship, that only the prophet gets revelations for the whole church. You don't just get to decide to barbecue your leader. And finally, it was a huge public lesson in humility. It showed everyone what happens when spiritual pride gets out of control. And this whole incident is just the perfect snapshot of that time. It was an era of these huge, profound feelings of faith, but also spectacular weirdness. It's this perfect mix of celestial comedy and divine purpose, and it really just sums up the wild, raw energy of the early days in Kirtland. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. When it really comes down to it, what's more powerful? A big, loud, dramatic spectacle of faith, or the quiet, confident power of a perfectly timed punchline?